¿Qué tal? I'm Antonio Tijerino, host of the Fritanga Podcast by the Hispanic Heritage Foundation. In the podcast today, we will dig into the migrant crisis at the border, a humanitarian crisis that extends into Latin America and many other parts of the world far beyond our borders. Joining me for this ever-changing but always timely conversation is Krish O'Mara Vignarajah, the president and CEO of Global Refuge. I've always said that we're as effective in advocacy as the call you get and the call you can make. And Krish has always been one of the first people I call when it comes to ensuring that our immigrant and refugee communities are protected, supported, represented, and treated with dignity on the ground in our narratives and in our policies. Krish's journey as an immigrant is inspiring. She was born amidst the turmoil of civil war in Sri Lanka. Her family fled their home country when she was just 9 months old and arrived in Maryland with $200 and no jobs. Her parents' resilience laid the foundation for Krish's remarkable career in public service. Her advocacy on behalf of migrants, immigrants, refugees, and anyone that is in need is deeply personal. Krish served as policy director for First Lady Michelle Obama and as senior advisor under Secretaries of State Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. At the White House, Krish led the First Lady's Let Girls Learn initiative and coordinated refugee and migration programs at the State Department. She's been recognized as one of the Daily Record's top 100 women and most admired CEOs, among many other accolades. With Krish's knowledge, perspective, intellect, and heart leading the conversation, we will explore the current state of the migrant crisis, the impact of political exploitation, and the critical need for immigration reform. We'll also delve into Krish's important work being done by Global Refuge on behalf of vulnerable children, families, and individuals making the same decisions we would make. Krish and I share the strong belief that everyone, regardless of status, should be welcomed with dignity, respect, and opportunity in a country of immigrants and in need of immigrants. La lucha sigue. Now let's fritanga. Thank you for joining the Fritanga Podcast, my good friend, Krish Vignarajah. This is really important to me beyond being able to see your face, which I've missed because we haven't seen each other in a while, but you're my Sherpa when it comes to immigration, migrants, refugees, and just the journey of so many families like ours. And I also know how personally you and I deal with this issue because we're immigrants and we're parents and we have children that are just like the parents and children that we interacted with on the border when we went together. So let's jump right in, Krish. The current migrant crisis is in constant flux. It seems to change constantly, but it always ends up in the same place. And as we have seen historically, the news and perceptions shaped by the rhetoric have not always kept up with the realities of what's happening in the home countries during these arduous journeys on our borders and in our communities. So can you please start talking about where we are at this point? And I mean, there's so many elements to it, which is why you're the right leader in this space, because you have a policy background, you have the programmatic side, you have the actual delivery system and every other area. So where are we in this crisis currently? And give a little background over the last 10 years, touch upon it just for perspective to know where we are. We have to at least know what it's been like since 2014, let's say.
First, thank you so much for having me on. I've always been grateful for our partnership. I am eternally indebted to you for being on our President's Council and just being a passionate ambassador for why the U.S. needs to continue to be a welcoming country. So in terms of what we're seeing at the border is the result of a humanitarian crisis, and it's one that originates far beyond our borders. Part of that is the collision between a broken immigration system that elected officials have refused to reform or failed in their ability to. When you hear sometimes people say they ought to come the right way, the reality is that our system is so outdated and convoluted that getting a visa is more like winning the lottery these days. You know, no one wants to see this kind of disorder at the border, but they also don't want to see people forced to wait years or multiple decades just to reunite with family or get a work visa at a time when we have millions of jobs that are not filled. And so I think that's where it's important to understand, globally, we have 114 million who have been displaced, and that number is only going to increase. At our borders, we are seeing a significant number of increasing encounters. That's not just over the last couple of years, but has been something we've seen, for several years. But also, when you ask for the perspective of what does that look like over a decade, it is important to understand that some of what we are seeing is cyclical. And, it depends on what season where we will see increased numbers. But we will also see surges on a regular basis. And I think that's where it's important for us to understand these dynamics and to prepare so that we don't get caught flat-footed.
Those surges are coming from different countries at different times. I know when I was just down there with my daughter a few years ago, there were so many people from Haiti, and it was like an uptick in Venezuelans and Nicaraguans and Cubans. And before then, it was mostly Central Americans from the Northern Triangle. And now that's gone down significantly. And from what I understand, last time I went, it seemed like it was 3 out of 4 were from Venezuela. And the correlation is not hard to figure out. Where there is despair, where there is a need to move on, where there is despair for different reasons, whether it's climate change, whether it's corruption, whether it's violence, just trying to get footing for families in a better place. But I'm confused about it, and I actually follow it in terms of what's the waiting room? What are the different names that we hear thrown about? Remain in Mexico, and then sometimes they get renamed, almost like a euphemism for the same kind of policies. And where are we in terms of the policies? Where are we in terms of the flow of migrants? And then I actually want to talk about Global Refuge, because you're not just dealing with our border on the United States border, you're dealing with all over the world.
So I'll start with two of the key demographics. So when you think about refugees, for example, this is a label applied to those who cross an international border. They register with the UN, or sometimes they'll go directly to the U.S. Embassy. They flee because they are being targeted, whether that's for political or religious persecution, violence, any sort of armed conflict. Only less than 1% of refugees are ever resettled internationally. And I think that's, in part because while the U.S. has really led the charge in terms of welcoming refugees, how many refugees we will accept in a given year really depends on who's in power. This is why presidential elections matter. So just to give you a little bit of context, at the end of the Obama administration, the president had set the presidential determination, or the PD, at 110,000. Under the Trump administration, that kind of year over year declined until it was 15,000. But really, in the last 2 years of the Trump administration, we resettled about 11,000. As candidate, President Biden committed to resettling 125,000. The first couple of years, the presidential determination that Biden set was actually not at that number. And so this is why we and other resettlement agencies, your organization, other humanitarian groups, were explaining that this is the system that resettles those fleeing humanitarian crises, and we need to do our part, because when we lead, other countries do follow. And so it's really heartening to see that this year, the Biden administration has been fully committed to resettling 125,000. They have rebuilt the infrastructure. And now, actually, domestically, the resettlement agencies are trying to keep up, which I think it's important to note, because this is where affordable housing, finding the volunteers, finding the private philanthropy to support what's a public-private partnership is critically important. But it is really heartening to know that we will get well over 100,000 refugees into the U.S. this year. But when you think about the southern border, that is where we're thinking about asylum seekers. So these are individuals who may be fleeing for the very same reasons of religious persecution, political targeting. But in order for them to exercise their legal right to seek asylum, they actually need to reach American soil. And so this is where, when people say, they shouldn't come to the southern border, they should go through a legal process. For those who are seeking asylum, they are going through a legal process when they come and they apply for asylum. But we have seen, some historic numbers of over 2 million encounters. It's important when you think about that 2 million encounters, that isn't people who have necessarily been admitted to the US. Many of those are repeat border crossers who, under Title 42, which was applied under the Trump administration and the Biden administration, it was a public health emergency rule that didn't really have a kind of substantiated basis, but it was applied more as a border management tool. These are individuals who could be returned. They weren't kind of fully processed. And so we did see repeat border crosses. And so that 2 million, I just want to contextualize that. So those are kind of two main demographics. The third I would mention, just because of Global Refuge's expertise in caring for kids, is unaccompanied children. We have seen a surge. There are some important dynamics for why we've seen that. Part of it is that a substantial number of the children, the majority, are children who have a parent or guardian here in the US. And so when we talk about unaccompanied children, we're really talking about family reunification, because they are traveling in order to be reunited with a parent, a guardian, a close relative. But it's also that our policies, when we clamp down on other types of immigrants coming into the US, but we do allow children, it does create a system where in some cases families are so desperate to get their children out of these, dire circumstances, that if they know that if they travel together, they would be rejected at the border, parents are facing this impossible choice of either the child reaches protection or the entire family is returned. And so that is in part why you are seeing an increase in the number of unaccompanied kids.
I appreciate that you just explained a lot of these terms that you hear. The difference between refugee, difference between a migrant, difference between an asylum seeker, an unaccompanied minor. They all somehow blend together. And that's where the rhetoric starts taking hold. And people see a migrant as different than a refugee in terms of welcoming them into our country. So what happens with Ukraine or Afghanistan and other places somehow is seen differently than someone that's coming from Central America or Haiti and other places. Can you talk about that in the work that you've been doing? Because you're trying to help everyone.
Yeah. And it's really not shocking in the sense that the racism that we see in other, elements of society, our immigration policy is not immune from those distinctions. But it's obviously difficult as a humanitarian organization. You and I have obviously been allies in trying to articulate a system that treats those who are fleeing similar circumstances similarly. But of course, in our recent past, we've seen a system that has allowed for Ukrainians, initially 20,000, to come through the southern border at a time when Haitians who were fleeing dire circumstances were violently expelled. Ultimately, the administration did create a Uniting for Ukraine program. We have been heartened when the administration has acted to provide temporary protected status to Haitians and other nationals from countries that are experiencing turmoil in a way that it is dangerous to return. And so I think we hope that President Biden and the administration will continue to show that leadership. But our overarching point is, if people are fleeing for their lives, while I understand that there are limits to what the U.S. can do for the entire globe, we're not going to be able to provide refuge for all 114 million who are displaced today. But as I said, we have always been a global humanitarian leader. It is a significant part of our identity as a nation of immigrants. And it comes at a time when economically we need the vitality of immigrants, because we are facing the lowest birth rate since the census has been tracking this issue. Not to mention that we know, as a national security matter, that recent events in terms of the collapse of Afghanistan and the Taliban control, as well as the invasion of Ukraine, have shown us that immigration is an important tool in how we address international crises.
Thank you so much for saying that. That's where your perspective and your experiences across your life really brings such value to your leadership position over at Global Refuge. I have to say, someone said something to me that I'm very close to, and because it all seems so confusing. And what she said when she saw me frustrated about the current state or lack of activism around this issue, which is something I'll get to in a minute, that I've really seen a cool down. She said people will have a hard time supporting an issue they don't understand or don't see a solution to. It hit me in a very different way as somebody that leads with his heart. And she was right. So what would the case be that you would make to get more people involved? Like they were, for instance, when children were being separated, and we went to the border in support of Sister Norma and Pimentel and others that were doing that work. It seemed so much easier because people got their heads around what was happening and how things needed to change. So what would the case be now for a better understanding of the issue, as well as that somehow there is a solution? Because nobody really speaks of solutions. They just speak of trying to address the humanitarian crisis, but that doesn't necessarily mean a solution.
Yeah, and I think there are two parts to that. Part of what we need to do is just counter the fear mongering and the misinformation, because I do think part of my job feels like it's myth busting and fighting fiction with fact. These days, you turn on the TV, you pick up a newspaper, and you would think that immigrants and immigration are the root cause of every single problem we're facing, because we have political quote unquote leaders who are misleading the American public and scapegoating immigrants as the source of the opioid epidemic, when the reality is that a vast majority, right, of these drugs are coming through commercial
airports.
Right, exactly.
Not the border.
That's right. And they're being smuggled by U.S. citizens for U.S. citizens. This is a national crisis, but we've got to understand that the root cause of this is not immigration. You hear from political leaders that immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country. And I think that type of white nationalism, dog whistles, is just inappropriate. And we've got to understand that even actually for the white population, immigration has actually been a part of why we haven't seen a decline. And so I think that's where, the best defense is offense, in my view. So this is where we've got to figure out, how do we proactively message that immigration is not just the right thing to do, it's a smart thing to do, and make that argument in a multi-front fashion. So explaining that for economic reasons, we ought to be supporting immigration in an orderly fashion so that we can fill the millions of jobs that are unfilled. And those are jobs ranging from, construction workers. We're headquartered in Baltimore. Obviously, the sad reality of all the construction workers who died working on Francis Scott Key Bridge were immigrants. And I think that's just a great example of where, when we as Americans go to bed, it is in part immigrant laborers who are getting up in the middle of the night and they're doing the hard work. But it's also, for every 1% increase in international students who come to our universities, we double the number of patents per capita from 9% to 18%, right? Nearly 50% of the Fortune 500 companies were founded by an immigrant or their child. And so this is where I think it is critically important for us to understand that if we are to remain a superpower, an economic superpower, immigration's got to be a part of that solution. But as I said, it's not just an economic argument. It is also an argument for, how do we keep Medicare and Social Security afloat? Well, it is immigrants. It's even right now undocumented immigrants who are paying into the system, who will never receive the benefit themselves, but they help contribute. It's also the national security argument of, I use the examples of Afghanistan and Ukraine, but even in kind of the competitive dynamic we see with China. China has gone from a one-child policy to encouraging now 2 children and now 3 children, funding IVF, because they know that they face the same kind of demographic cliff that we face. which is an aging population that requires an increased younger population. And so immigration's got to be a part of that solution. And then finally, just understanding our history as a country. Part of our strength has always come from the willingness of people to risk everything, to give up everything, and to move to this country. We are lucky enough that people still tragically sometimes risk their lives to come here. And that is a comparative advantage and strength of our country.
I couldn't agree with you more. And on the China part, that's a distinct advantage the United States has to not be a homogenous country while they are. And they're even trying to boost it kind of internally where we can actually benefit from immigrants. But the problem is, my good friend, that there's now this fight over resources that we saw in New York and in Chicago last year, where it's now become broken out into almost like a divide, even between the different groups fighting over those resources. And that rhetoric actually is being used by people on both sides now, where they're taking over, they're using up all our resources when we should be using for this group. And then, of course, that means that positions change. What we heard when President Biden was running is very different than I will close the border if I'm able to right now, and raising the threshold of what it is to be an asylum seeker. And that is very disturbing to me. And I know that this administration wants to do the right thing, but politically, it's now becoming a way of inoculating each other or attacking each other, and human beings are being used as part of that strategy. Can you talk about the environment we're in now? Because every time there's a poll, you see immigration at the top of the poll, right up with the economy and the price of food and everything else that we're battling. How are you, from parts of the country that are nowhere near a border or don't even get an influx of migrants, how much of that is just plain xenophobia?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I would say a big part of it. And I think that your description of the political dynamics are spot on. And so I think there's a couple components of this. Part of this is that there is a path dependency to how we got to where we are right now. Sadly, in the first few years of this administration, it was impressive on day one, the number of kind of executive orders that were focused on immigration. And as you said, President Biden as a candidate laid out a bold and very different vision from his predecessor. There was a stark contrast, but when you see the rhetoric coming out of both presidential candidates today, there is a equally kind of stark similarity in the sentiment, particularly when it comes to our southern border. And I think part of it is, for the last few years, we have heard a very vocal narrative from one side that immigrants are crime perpetrating leeches on taxpayer dollars who are feeding the fentanyl crisis. And on the other side, you've heard radio silence. And I think there must have been some political calculation that immigration was their Achilles heel, and it was safer to not talk about the issue than to counter that fictitious narrative. So it's been very frustrating, as someone who believes that the facts are all on our side, because I actually do see, in my experience of going across the country to some of the most conservative places, where if you make the case, right, when you make an argument of kind of, here's what you're hearing and here's actually the truth, and then you say, well, look, the system is broken, no one disagrees with that, but it is within our reach as a policy matter or programmatically to fix it. What we lack is the political will. That's where I think people sort of open their eyes and they're like, wow, this is actually something that we can resolve if we have the resolve to do so. Sometimes it feels like you're hitting your head against a wall, because you'll talk to both sides of the aisle, and some conversations, someone will say, yes, I completely agree with you on fixing the economic visa issue. But if I fix the economic visa issue, then I give up a bargaining chip to address
Yeah.
Dreamers. And when that means you've got to be able to pull together comprehensive immigration reform, you realize we're in the rut of comprehensive immigration reform not really moving anytime recently. But that said, what gives me hope is we actually had, the Gang of Eight working together to come up with a bipartisan solution. Not perfect, right? But we actually did have some substantive dialogue and debate just 10 years ago. And so I think this is where I don't see it happening before the election, but I really do pray that we will have the political courage to fix a broken system. And just the last thing I will say is it's really frustrating when you sense that people don't want to fix it because they want it to be a wedge issue. And even when there was a bill proposed and it was clear that politicians just thought, no, want to use this for kind of political purposes, it's as you said, we are playing with people's lives.
That is the most cynical part, when you've actually capitulated on so many of these issues. One side's trying to use it as a wedge issue. The other side's trying to take away that wedge issue. And how much are we supposed to take of this gamesmanship that's happening, as if we're watching two football teams playing against each other instead of servants that are supposed to be serving America and keeping in line with the ideals that this country was stood up on. And I have to say, too, that as we talk about this, I'm not equivocating in any way. One side's trying to do away with birthright citizenship, potentially, and deport millions of people. Nevertheless, I feel as though there's no outrage right now, where I feel like there was before. Even friends that we have in the movement, Krish, are almost resigned to the chaos instead of trying to address it and certainly resolve it. And you're dependent on Congress. They're not going to do anything. So how do you increase, for instance, there's like almost 3.5 million cases pending as of the end of last year, and what is like 680 judges. That means the average caseload is going to be like 4,500 per judge. That doesn't happen if you don't have money appropriated by Congress. That isn't going to do that. So we're not even trying to solve the issue, or investment in Latin America and other places. It's critical. If you can't present a potential solution, you're going to have a hard time having people really come together and support what's happening right now. But I feel as though some of the loudest voices from just a few years ago are exasperated. Maybe they're just worn out, because I just don't have that same energy. And I went out to lunch the other day with someone. I was all fired up. I was yelling about what I want. And you've seen me on some of the meetings that we've had, where I'm like, well, how can we do this? And I don't know if people that are trying to be more pragmatic with the changing playing field that we have now, and I'm certainly never pragmatic, but I'm just trying to find the outrage in how human beings are being treated, the outrage in the lack of empathy, the outrage in the political gamesmanship, and the outrage in the clear, as you put it, the economic reasons that we need to have these migrants be enveloped into what we do and imbued into the American culture. It's big business. I just don't understand how you are working against your best interest right now. But that's what happens when politics get involved, and racism and xenophobia and other things. Who's doing it right? And you deal with it globally at Global Refuge. So who do you think is doing it right? What other countries can we learn from?
Oh, gosh. I mean, this is where what we're experiencing in terms of the fear-mongering and the xenophobia are not unique. And that is the partly distressing piece of this, because, as I said, when we are a global humanitarian leader, and people see how we respond, and it either inspires good behavior or it justifies bad behavior. Even looking to the UK and some of these policies of, can you outsource immigration to Rwanda, other European nations where white nationalist parties, what previously were viewed as fringe anti-immigration parties are now competitive, if not in power. It's a very distressing dynamic. I will say Canada has been very thoughtful in some of their immigration policies. They've also been strategic in realizing that as we have tended towards some of these kind of giving into these anti-immigration sentiments, they realize that it could be a competitive advantage for them, which is why we've seen some aggressive recruiting of immigrants who have come to the U.S. are contributing to our economy as software developers, other industries, where Canada is seeing that because some of them are in the backlogs that you've described, there is no permanent pathway, and so they are in the uncertain state of being here tethered to an economic visa, which if they lose that with their company, they could be forced to have to return to a country they've never, haven't lived in for decades. Canada's aggressively recruiting, saying, come to our country, we will welcome you with open arms. And so I think it's important to just not take this for granted. But the other thing I'll say is when you talk about some of the dynamics that we've seen of late and the lack of outrage, to me, it's also that, like, maybe I'm one of those people who's resigned myself to not even expecting outrage, but the idea that some of the polling is showing that the American public actually supports previous political leaders who have embraced family separation, for example, right?
Yeah.
And have
Yeah.
repeated that as a policy that they would put in place, that they trust such a political leader as generally better on immigration is worrisome, because I think to me it means we just have not done a good job of explaining what's at stake, and that when someone says something, believe them in terms of what they're going to do, if return to power. And I guess just the final point I'll make is when you talked about the top issues right now with the American public of immigration and the economy, I think it's just important to make the connection, because inflation is in part being driven by anti-immigration policies that we've seen in the past. And yes, of course, we've got to make sure that we protect wages that our workers can live on, right? We've got to make sure that those are strong. But we also have to recognize that some of the costs of agricultural products increasing are in part because we don't, have the economies. We don't have the workers we need to keep a vibrant economy. And I think that's where people have to understand that they are paying a price premium for xenophobic anti-immigration policies.
So I want to ask you, what are the policies that you feel we should head to? You've talked a little bit about it, but can you touch upon those 3 or 4 main areas where you, Krish, would change things? And I have to let the viewers know that you're someone that was doing work for the Obama administration, and you're Mrs. Obama's policy person. Your career has spanned across so many areas, and you couple that intellect and that passion with actually having been an immigrant from Sri Lanka and where your family came from. So you have a broad experience and perspectives and sensitivity, as well as your intellect and knowledge of how government works and policy works. And that's why you're the perfect person to be talking about this. So can you talk about what would you do?
One is something you touched on, which I think is a bipartisan solution of investing to restore stability in a way that we won't see as significant an influx as we have seen as of late. When you think about 114 million displaced globally, it is a daunting number, particularly when you realize that as a result of the climate crisis, that's a fraction of what we're going to see in decades to come. By 2050, we will have 216 million migrants as a result of the climate crisis. And frankly, if you talk to Al Gore, you would say that that's even an underestimate of what we should expect. And so I think that's where, we launched a new international office in Guatemala with a focus on children. We feel like that should be a bipartisan solution. And the U.S. should really invest in our backyard, not just because in some cases we were a part of why there has been turmoil over the decades in terms of our involvement through foreign policy, but also because we do have a self-interest in ensuring that we can help create some stability and prosperity in our region so that people don't have to make a choice that they don't want to, which is to leave their home country, to leave their family, to come to the US. I think second, it's upholding a family value that I think is as American as apple pie, which is family reunification. It shouldn't be that it takes 2 or 3 decades for a family reunification application to be reviewed and processed, because that's a lifetime
Yeah.
for some, right? And so that's not a system that works. And we are seeing some of those family reunification cases try to come through the southern border because that desperation has led them to feel like maybe that is the only realistic and timely process. Third, I would say that we need to make sure that we have a humanitarian system that is nimble through refugee resettlement. That ought to be the way that we respond to global crises, but that requires that it not take several years for application to be processed, because when you're fleeing your home because it's on fire, you don't sit around and wait for months or years, right? You do need a system that is nimble. So it needs to be efficient and effective, but that we also have an asylum system at our southern border. It is consistent with US law. It's consistent with international legal obligations that we have as a member of an international coalition, so that the asylum system exists. But also that, and maybe this segues to my next kind of point, which is economic migrants shouldn't come through the southern border. But that means that we have an economic visa system that allows for us to meet the needs of US companies, meet the needs of our economy, but also is a pathway that those who are coming to work, are able to do so.
I want to lastly ask you, what would you say as the head of Global Refuge, as a leader in this space, as a leader to a lot of others like me, that we look to you in terms of giving us that guidance, that information, and even resources in terms of being able to partner with you as you're doing work with the Afghanistan community when they come over, in terms of job opportunities and helping with the children and everything else that I've seen you do firsthand. What is the advice? What is the action call that you are giving to activists and people like me on addressing this? How do you galvanize us and mobilize us to have that same energy that we had a few years ago?
So first, I think in the short term, we should feel positive because the facts are all on our side. And what I have found is that even in conversations where the majority of folks come in with kind of an anti-immigration sentiment, that I have found that Americans are willing to take in information, open-minded. In some cases, some of that anti-immigration sentiment is a little bit more academic, because they'll say, I don't believe that the U.S. should be accepting immigrants in the way that we are. But I will say that, I really like my doctor, and I really like, the landscaping company that comes to my home. And I'm appreciative that I have a neighbor who works hard and they contribute and they come to my church. And so I think that's where trying to foster those personal connections so that this is a more personal issue is a real opportunity. Second, I would say that in the medium term, we need ambassadors. We need people who, frankly, are not me, because I am an immigrant. I run an immigration organization in Global Refuge. And so I think sometimes what I say is discounted. But the truth is that for the vast majority of Americans, unless your family was forced to come through, as a result of slavery, or you're part of the indigenous community, someone in your family made an intentional decision to come to the US. And so we need people to explain and have the empathy to say that they are us. They're just the latest wave of immigration. And so that's why I think that, we put out action alerts. We have volunteer opportunities, whether it's refugee resettlement, whether it's being a part of our foster care program for unaccompanied children. It's a system where you can just provide a loving home for a child who is just trying to reunite with their mother, but it takes us a few weeks to help the mother work through the paperwork and go through the background checks to make sure that this isn't a case of, human trafficking. So there are lots of ways to roll up your sleeves if you want to and get involved, but there's also ways that you can just, sit on your laptop and help us through engaging on action alerts. A lot of this information is on our website, which is globalrefuge.org. But we really do hope that people kind of get off the sidelines. We can't have passive observers. We are fighting to define who we are as a nation. And I really do hope that being in part a nation of immigrants isn't just a past, part of our past, but part of our future.
So there you have it. You can get involved by going to globalrefuge.org. And it's really important that Krish gives us an opportunity to not feel helpless, to not feel unenergized, to not feel exasperated and beaten down in supporting the migrant, refugee, asylum-seeking immigrant communities that are part of this nation and our very existence, not to mention our best chance to continue to move forward. So, Krish, now I will end with the final question, which is culture comforts. And Fritanga Podcast is based around the notion that we want to bring people together for information, for inspiration, for action, which you have just provided us with, but also for comfort. And so I'm going to ask you, what food, what music, what smells, what gives you comfort? And so start with food. Maybe it's something that your grandmother used to cook or your grandfather would make. What music that is in the bucket? And I know your oldest daughter, which is a music fanatic because I've danced with her. So what music makes you also feel comfort? And then, is there a smell, or like I remember like just smelling Fabuloso with that, the purple one, that would, when it was like you had a clean house, and it would make me feel comfort. So what are those things that bring you comfort?
Gosh, that's a great question. So in terms of music, I will say I do. So when I was pregnant with my now 1-year-old, I would sometimes have music on in the background. Who knows whether it would actually impact her being a baby Einstein, but
We all do that.
I figured no harm, right?
Don't worry. Yeah, at
Yeah,
least
and
we have fun listening to it.
yeah, exactly. And it is soothing to me. I do enjoy it. At the same time, as you said, my older one, who's 6, we love little dance parties. It's such a nice way, especially after kind of a long work day of video conference after video conference. This is uplifting, but some of my meetings are a little draining. It's really nice to just find a music, like just something that has a beat, where we'll just kind of break into dance. So that definitely is a comfort and just fun to kind of feel a vibe with her. In terms of foods, I'm from Sri Lanka. I really do love South Asian food. So generally speaking, like especially when I was pregnant with my daughter, I'd actually have cravings of Indian food. But particularly what I like, my dad makes, it's called dosa, DOSA. It's basically like a sourdough pancake, and you can use it to eat with any sorts of curries, but it's got some flavor. It's partly made of lentils, so it's healthy. But yeah, I always love that with some we call it gingerly oil, but I guess it's sesame
Mm-hmm.
oil. I also love sushi. And my 6-year-old also loves sushi. So it's great because, my husband, Colin, who's not as big a fan of Japanese food, of sushi. So it's nice to kind of have her weigh in now, so that we can actually go to a Japanese restaurant. And then in terms of smells,
By the way, I'm sure Colin is going to be working on the 1-year-old to be on his side.
I
So
know
then you'll have a
exactly.
tie again.
That's right. And he loves Mexican. So, and we do too, but it's nice to have some variety. And then in terms of smells, I really appreciate that question because there was actually a medical webinar I was on about 6 months ago saying that to stimulate the brain, you need to expose yourself to 4 different smells a day. And it's sometimes difficult, like unless you're intentional to do that. So I love flowers, so particularly lavender, and I like honeysuckle. It's a great reason to be outdoors and something I enjoy.
magnolias coming right now because they're all over the place,
Oh,
and you
yeah.
can walk by a tree and just take in that smell. Yeah, it's unfortunately sometimes unintentionally I'm around a lot of smells that I wish I wasn't around.
Right.
But yes, being intentional about good smells. Krish, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I appreciate you so much. I count on you. You comfort me, you inform me, and you inspire me. Just appreciate you being a leader in this space, and Global Refuge, the work you do there is absolutely a privilege to just be in your orbit in some small way. I just appreciate you so much and your friendship more than anything else.
Well, ditto for everything you just said. It is really one of the blessings thanks to this job in terms of connecting with you. And I've just been so grateful for your partnership, your friendship, and you just being an inspiring leader. So thank you for having me on.